Long before history began, long before the first words were pressed into clay, or the first kings built walls of stone, the Earth was a different planet. The year would not have mattered then, but in our reckoning, it was around 300,000 BCE. Most of Europe and northern Asia lay beneath vast fields of ice, sheets a kilometer thick ground across the land, carving valleys that still mark maps today. Winds blew colder, sharper, and the sunlight itself had a clearer tone, falling across tundras of pale grass and lonely spruce. In Africa, where the equatorial sun still burned through dust and haze, new beings walked the savannas. Fossils from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco and Omo Kibish in Ethiopia show that Homo sapiens, humans like us, had appeared. They chipped blades of flint with long, confident strokes and carried them in leather pouches at their sides. They hunted gazelle and antelope, slept in shallow caves, and painted their bodies with red ochre. The world was raw, but intelligence had awakened within it. For hundreds of thousands of years, the Earth's climate wavered between glacial and mild. During colder intervals, the deserts widened and food grew scarce. When warmth returned, grasslands spread and rivers came alive again. Around 200,000 BCE, humans clustered near freshwater lakes of East Africa. At Lake Turkana and Olduvai Gorge, archaeologists have found tools made from volcanic glass, evidence of planning, of understanding how one rock could cut another. By 150,000 BCE, the world's ice reached its farthest grasp. Herds of mammoth and steppe bison moved like slow tides across Eurasia. Saber-toothed cats stalked the edges. Small groups of humans followed them, learning to read the pattern of tracks in snow. In the shelter of sea caves such as Blombos Cave on South Africa's southern coast, people shaped bone awls and carved cross-hatched patterns on ochre blocks, abstract marks, the earliest known expressions of symbolic thought. Tens of thousands of years passed. Glaciers retreated again, and the Red Sea narrowed to a chain of shallow channels. Around 70,000 BCE, some humans looked north across the water and began to cross. They moved in small family bands, following beaches rich with shellfish. Within a few generations, they reached Arabia, then Iran and India. Archaeological layers at Jwalapuram in southern India preserve their stone flakes beneath ancient volcanic ash. These travelers were not nomads in ignorance. They were explorers guided by tides, stars, and memory. The earth they entered was wild with new colors. Tropical rainforests covered Southeast Asia, while winds sculpted the deserts of Arabia into endless waves. In these lands, humans met other kinds of humans, the Neanderthals of Europe and the Denisovans of Central Asia. DNA recovered from Denisova Cave in Siberia shows that some of our ancestors shared life and children with them. The result is still in us today, small traces of those ancient cousins folded into our genes. By 50,000 BCE, humans had reached the islands of Indonesia. At low sea levels, the islands formed one broad continent, Sunda land, thick with jungles and rivers. Cave walls on Sulawesi still bear red handprints and paintings of Anoa, the small wild buffalo of the region, dated to nearly the same age. A little farther east, across narrow straits, another world awaited. By 45,000 BCE, people had reached Australia, carrying stone tools and simple rafts. They lit fires that changed landscapes, opening the forests to grassland, helping giant kangaroos and marsupial lions fade into legend. To the north, ice still ruled Europe, yet humans pressed into its fringes. At Bacho Kiro Cave in Bulgaria, Stone blades and pendants dated to 46,000 BCE mark the arrival of our species on that cold frontier. Within a few millennia, they spread along the Danube Valley, through the Carpathians, and onto the Great Plain where reindeer grazed under endless skies. They met Neanderthals, traded tools, perhaps stories, and eventually replaced them, but not through war alone. Genes and culture blended, as they always have. Around 40,000 BCE, something remarkable blossomed. Art. Deep inside Chauvet Cave in France, torchlight flickered across walls alive with images: bison, rhinoceroses, lions, and horses galloping in overlapping lines. The artists mixed pigments of ochre and charcoal with animal fat, using fingers, brushes of hair, and even hollow bones to spray paint across stone. The cool air of the cave preserved it all. To stand there today is to stand before minds no less creative than ours. Across the continent, other hands carved flutes from the wing bones of vultures. At Hohlefels in Germany, a tiny ivory figurine of a woman, perhaps a goddess, perhaps an ancestor, was shaped around 38,000 BCE. These were not idle acts. They signaled memory, teaching, and shared belief. Around fires in the darkness, language grew more complex, able to carry stories across generations. By 30,000 BCE, humans lived from the Atlantic to Siberia. The great Loess plains were cold, but rich with game. Families built shelters from mammoth bones at Mesopotamia in Ukraine, arranging ribs in circles and covering them with hides. Fires burned at the center, smoke escaping through holes above. Children played with beads made from teeth and shell. In those homes, one can almost feel the nearness of modern life. Meanwhile, in Asia, other innovations appeared. The people of the Upper Paleolithic in Siberia shaped microblades so sharp that archaeologists still cut themselves handling them. In China, painted pebbles and carved bone needles speak of clothing finely stitched for cold winds. Humanity had truly adapted to every environment on Earth, except the frozen core of Antarctica. By 25,000 BCE, the world entered its coldest stretch. The last glacial maximum bound the seas in ice and drew the water of oceans into frozen sheets. Sea levels dropped more than 100 meters. Britain joined Europe. Japan connected to Korea. New Guinea and Australia formed one wide continent called Sahul. Across the newly exposed plains of Beringia, humans and animals could walk from Siberia to Alaska. Herds of caribou and bison passed each spring, and small bands followed them eastward, carrying the first human footprints into the Americas. Stone tools found at Bluefish Caves in the Yukon and at Buttermilk Creek in Texas hint at their journeys. The Ice Age world was quieter than ours, though not empty. Wind howled over tundra, and the night sky burned with unfamiliar constellations. Imagine that silence. A campfire's crackle, the soft percussion of flint striking flint, and beyond that, only the sigh of snow. Humanity endured by cooperation, by knowledge passed mouth to mouth. When the ice began to melt around 18,000 BCE, rivers surged from beneath glaciers. The planet warmed rapidly, sometimes within a single human lifetime. Forests crept north. Mammoths and woolly rhinos retreated. People followed the changing ecosystems, leaving old camps behind. In the Near East, valleys once dry became green corridors filled with gazelle and wild barley. Hunters began to linger there longer each year. By 14,000 BCE, groups in the Levant built stone huts at Ohalo, 2 on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. They wove mats of reeds and gathered thousands of charred seeds. Archaeologists studying those floors found grinding stones. The first hints that humans were not just gathering, but processing grain deliberately. It was the seed, both literal and figurative, of agriculture. Then came a sudden chill. The Younger Dryas, beginning around 12,900 BCE. For more than 1,000 years, the world fell back into near-glacial cold. Lakes froze again, and many animals vanished. Yet humanity adapted. In what is now Turkey, people of the Epipaleolithic period began to cooperate on larger projects. On a limestone ridge above the Harran Plain, they quarried massive pillars and set them upright in circles. The site we now call Göbekli Tepe. Radiocarbon dates place its earliest construction around 9,500 BCE, long before farming was common. Each pillar, carved with reliefs of foxes and vultures, was a statement of unity and faith, perhaps built to honor spirits or ancestors. The climate warmed once more, and the Holocene epoch, the age we still live in, began. By 9000 BCE, the old ways of hunting and gathering were blending with the new ways of sowing and herding. Villages appeared along rivers. At Jericho, beside the Jordan, people raised a stone tower 9 meters high and built a wall around their settlement. The air smelled of wet clay and freshly ground grain. Goats bleated from pens. Dogs trotted between doorways. In central Anatolia, the people of Çatalhöyük, around 7,400 BCE, built homes so close together that rooftops formed streets. Walls glowed with red ochre paintings of aurochs and hunters. Beneath the floors, the dead slept among the living. Tools of obsidian, black volcanic glass traded from distant Cappadocia, lay beside every hearth. Life had become domestic, but memory of the wild still pulsed through art and ritual. Across the planet, similar awakenings occurred. In China's Yellow River Basin, millet was cultivated by 7,000 BCE. In South Asia's Mehrgar, people built mud brick houses and raised zebu cattle. Along the Nile, the first farmers tended emmer wheat as hippos moved through flooded fields. On every continent except Antarctica, humans were shaping the land to their will. And through all of this, the old world was vanishing. The rising seas swallowed Doggerland between 6,500 and 6,000 BCE. The Persian Gulf filled, covering what may once have been a fertile oasis. Memories of these floods may echo in later myths. The great inundations remembered by the Sumerians, and, centuries later, in the story of Noah. The forgotten world before history ended not with an event, but with a transition. Humanity stepped from the long twilight of prehistory into the dawn of civilization. Writing would not appear for another 3,000 years, but the foundations were laid. Community, agriculture, and the sense that the land itself could be shaped by mind and hand. As the millennia turned after 7,000 BCE, the warming Earth looked nothing like the frozen planet of our ancestors. Forests spread northward into what had been tundra. Birch, oak, and pine returned to Europe. Lakes filled the scars left by the melting glaciers, great inland seas such as the Baltic. Once a glacial basin, now teeming with fish. Herds of red deer and wild boar thrived in these new woodlands, and humans followed them, adapting once again to a changing planet. In this greener world, life settled into cycles that felt familiar. Planting, harvesting, herding, winter fires. The stone tools of the Mesolithic peoples became finer, more specialized. Microliths, tiny blades set into wooden shafts, were used for arrows and sickles. Fishing hooks of bone and antler appear at lake sites like Starcar in northern England, where wooden platforms and preserved footprints still lie beneath peat. There, around 8,700 BCE, families built brushwood huts on the edge of a reedy lake, keeping fires burning against the chill winds that still swept from the north. By 7,500 BCE, the rhythm of agriculture had taken hold from Anatolia to the Indus Valley. At Çatalhöyük, the air smelled of smoke and drying grain. Every roof held storage bins, every hearth a grinding stone. People painted cattle on their walls and shaped clay figurines of seated women, perhaps symbols of fertility, perhaps simply the comfort of familiarity. The town hummed with daily routine, food preparation, tool making, trade. From volcanic sources like Hassan Dagh, obsidian traveled hundreds of kilometers, proof of far-reaching exchange long before written commerce. To the south and east, along the Zagros Mountains, the people of Ganj Dara and Ali Kosh tended goats in stone-penned courtyards. Their animals were smaller than wild stock, already showing signs of domestication. Lighter bones, curved horns. In these quiet experiments lay the beginning of pastoral life, the partnership between human and herd that would one day shape entire civilizations. Farther east again, in the plains of Balochistan, the site of Mehrgar had begun to flourish. Mud brick houses, sometimes with plastered floors, lined narrow lanes. Residents stored barley, wheat, and dates. They shaped ornaments from lapis lazuli, carried from distant Afghan mountains. By 6,500 BCE, they were firing the first crude ceramics, small bowls baked in open kilns, their surfaces burnished by hand. It was a subtle but revolutionary change. Fire harnessed not just for warmth or cooking, but to create enduring materials. Across the world, the same pattern appeared, each culture in its own tempo. In northern China, the Peiligang and Sishan peoples ground millet into flour on sandstone querns. By 6,000 BCE, the first rice paddies gleamed in the valleys of the Yangtze. In the wetlands of Japan, the Jomon people coiled clay into pots, whose cord-marked patterns still give their name to an entire era. They were not farmers in the Near Eastern sense. They hunted and gathered, but they stored nuts, seeds, and shellfish through the winter. A semi-sedentary life made possible by abundance. The climate encouraged movement and contact. Rivers became highways. In the Near East, boats carved from single tree trunks slid down the Euphrates and the Tigris, carrying grain and obsidian, salt, and dried meat. In Europe, dugouts crossed the shallow seas that separated newly forming islands. The people of the Baltic traded amber. In the Mediterranean, obsidian from the island of Melos reached the coast of mainland Greece as early as 7,000 BCE. Even without writing, networks of exchange spanned thousands of kilometers. If we could have looked at the world from above then, the view would have been both familiar and alien. The Sahara was not yet the desert we know. It was green, a land of lakes and grasslands dotted with acacia trees. Rock engravings in the Tassili Najjar of Algeria showed giraffes, elephants, and herds of cattle, where sand now stretches unbroken. In those wet centuries after the Ice Age, the Sahara was alive with people who herded and hunted along the shores of broad lakes such as Lake Megachad, once among the largest bodies of fresh water on Earth. To the north, as the ice withdrew from Scandinavia, birch forests rooted in meltwater soil. Reindeer herders followed the thaw. Stone axes and harpoons found near Kamsa in Norway and Suomusjärvi in Finland mark their presence. They left carvings of elk and boats on the rocks, images that seem to glide today when sunlight moves across them, as though the carvers meant their pictures to live. Around 6,500 BCE, another great transformation was underway beneath the oceans. The sea continued its slow, unstoppable rise. The North Sea swallowed Doggerland, estuaries filled with salt water, cutting Britain away from Europe. The Persian Gulf flooded what had been a vast oasis plain, the so-called Gulf Oasis, fed by the ancient rivers that would later form the Tigris and Euphrates. Legends of a paradise lost beneath waves may trace their roots to memories of those drownings. In Southeast Asia, the same story repeated. As seas rose by dozens of meters, Sundaland fragmented into the islands of Indonesia and Malaysia. Tribes who once walked across open plains now saw salt water glinting between hills. Some built rafts and followed coastlines, giving birth to the seafaring traditions that millennia later would carry Austronesian peoples across the Pacific. Meanwhile, in the Levant and Anatolia, communities grew denser. Villages of hundreds became towns of thousands. Walls went up not only for protection, but as statements of identity. At Jericho, new layers covered the old tower. Its stone core still stands as witness to centuries of rebuilding. Archaeologists tracing its sequence have counted more than 20 distinct occupations, proof that people chose to stay, generation after generation, even when earthquakes toppled their homes. Continuity had entered human life. Within these settlements, social ties became intricate. Not everyone farmed. Some specialized as flint knappers, potters, or herders. Trade required trust, and trust required custom, early forms of social rule. No written laws yet existed, but obligations and kinship bound people together as surely as any future code. Ritual, too, deepened. At Çatalhöyük, skulls of aurochs and rams decorated household shrines. In some rooms, plastered human heads with painted features were placed beside them, perhaps honored ancestors watching over the living. Similar traditions appear across the Near East. At Ain Ghazal in Jordan, full-size statues made of plaster and reed were buried in pits around 6,500 BCE. Their blank eyes stare across 7 millennia at us today, evidence that even in prehistory, humans sought to give form to the unseen. By the closing of this long era, around 6,000 BCE to 5,000 BCE, the world was recognizable as the one that would soon give birth to history. Villages lined fertile river valleys. Fields of barley and emmer rippled in the wind. Shepherds watched flocks on hillsides that had never known wild predators. Clay tokens, small counters shaped like cones and discs, were beginning to represent quantities of grain or animals, an early step toward writing. The human mind, so long occupied with survival, now turned to record, measure, and plan. At night, the same stars shone that we see now, but they must have felt closer then, unpolluted, immense, mirrored in rivers and seas still clean. Children listened to stories beside hearths, tales of flood and fire, of spirits who ruled the sun and moon. Those stories would travel forward in time, transforming into the mythologies of Sumer, Egypt, and Greece. Their roots lie here, in this twilight between prehistory and memory. The forgotten world before history ended gently, almost imperceptibly, as generations who had once hunted beneath glaciers became farmers beneath the rising warmth. What we call civilization was not born in a moment. It emerged like dawn from a long night, light growing slowly across the horizon, revealing all that had been prepared in silence. When the 6th millennium BCE opened, the Earth had warmed into a steady rhythm. Ice still capped the poles, yet the heart of the continents was green again. Rivers carried snowmelt down from mountains newly free of glaciers, cutting valleys rich with silt. In these places, people discovered that the flood itself was their greatest ally. Each season's high water left a film of fertile earth. To plant where the flood had passed was to harvest more than any single family could eat. Along the twin rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates, settlements thickened. At first, they were little more than clusters of reed huts, raised on mounds above the floodplain. Places like Eridu, whose oldest levels date to around 5,400 BCE. People fished the shallow channels, grew barley on the receding mud, and shaped clay into small jars baked in open fires. Over generations, those mounds rose higher, each rebuild laid on the ruins of the last, until the land itself seemed to remember its inhabitants. By 5000 BCE, irrigation channels glimmered between the rivers. Farmers guided the floodwater through ditches lined with reeds. The invention was simple, but world-changing. For the first time, humans were not at the mercy of rain. Grain surpluses followed, and with them the need for storage, counting, and exchange. Clay tokens shaped as cones and spheres represented measures of grain or livestock. Sealed inside clay envelopes, they became the forerunners of accounting and, eventually, writing. The low plains of Sumer were flat and treeless, so people turned to mud brick. They molded it in wooden frames, dried it in the sun, and stacked it into walls. The first temples, ziggurats in embryo, rose above the plain. In the ruins of Eridu's earliest shrine, archaeologists have found altars of packed clay and offerings of shells from the distant Gulf. Even then, the idea had formed that heaven might be reached by raising the earth. At the same time, another river was shaping a different world. The Nile, flowing from the highlands of Africa to the Mediterranean, flooded with clock-like precision each summer. Along its banks, communities flourished in a ribbon of green cutting through desert. Villages such as Merimde, Fayoum, and Badari took root between 5000 and 4000 BCE. The people stored grain in woven silos, spun linen from flax, and carved ivory combs and palettes whose shapes foreshadow later Egyptian art. Life followed the river's pulse, sow when it recedes, harvest before the next rise. In the broader Middle East, innovation multiplied. Copper nodules collected from stream beds were hammered into ornaments, the earliest hints of metallurgy. At Çatalhöyük, the great Neolithic town still stood active, though its population slowly thinned as smaller farming villages spread outward. In Iran's high valleys, at Tepe Sialk and Susa, potters fired vessels in closed kilns that reached temperatures high enough to fuse clay into true ceramic. Painted in red and black spirals, their designs remain among the first recognizably human signatures of style. Far to the east, across the mountains and deserts of Central Asia, life along the Indus River was beginning to change as well. At Mehrgar, where generations had farmed barley and herded cattle since the 7th millennium BCE, craft specialization took hold. Beads of carnelian, shell, and turquoise moved between settlements. Their origins show trade stretching hundreds of kilometers. By 4500 BCE, Copper drills and tiny furnaces appear in the layers, small glows of the coming metal age. The world's population had grown perhaps to 20 or 30 million souls, yet the earth must still have felt empty. Vast tracts lay unvisited in any lifetime, forests dense, deserts uncharted. Travel was slow, measured by the pace of a laden animal or the push of a pole against a riverbed. But distance no longer meant isolation. Wherever waterways met, goods and ideas crossed. The obsidian from Anatolia, the shells from the Gulf, the lapis from Afghanistan, all passed hand to hand through middlemen who never saw their source. In southeastern Europe, along the Danube, the Vinca culture built tidy villages of rectangular houses around open courtyards. Their pottery, polished to black sheen, sometimes carries mysterious incised signs, perhaps numbers, perhaps the ancestors of later scripts. In the fertile plains of Ukraine, the Tripilian people raised enormous communal houses of wattle and daub. When a dwelling grew old, they burned it deliberately and built anew upon the ashes, creating great layered tells visible even from the air. Across the Aegean, the islands of Crete and Cyprus began to link the eastern and western worlds. Mariners learned to read the seasonal winds and to shape boats capable of open water voyages. By 4000 BCE, copper from Cyprus was traveling to Anatolia and the Levant. In return came timber, cloth, and wine. The Mediterranean, still narrow in its traffic, had opened as a blue road between emerging civilizations. At night, the same moon that guided those sailors watched over other peoples far away. In the broad valleys of northern China, the Yangshao culture painted bowls with spirals and stylized faces. Villages lined the banks of the Yellow River, surrounded by fields of millet. Pigs and dogs lived within the fences. Silkworms spun in baskets hung from rafters. The rhythm of family, field, and festival was not unlike that of Sumer or the Nile, a parallel growth born of necessity and ingenuity, not contact. In the rainforests of the New World, too, human hands were shaping landscapes. Around 4000 BCE, in the lowlands of Central America, people tended wild maize and squash. Along the Peruvian coast, fishing communities wove nets of cotton and built reed boats shaped like the waves they rode. The world was filling with the hum of settled life. From the Arctic Circle to the equator, fires glowed at night in permanent hearths. Within those fires, bronze was waiting to be discovered. By 3800 BCE, metal workers in the Iranian plateau learned that mixing copper with a little tin produced an alloy harder and more versatile than either metal alone. The Bronze Age was dawning, and with it, the potential for tools, weapons, and ornaments beyond anything stone could offer. Power began to collect in the hands of those who controlled the furnaces and the trade routes that fed them. In the lower Mesopotamian plain, new towns rose, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, each surrounding a temple dedicated to its guardian deity. The temples stored grain, collected tribute, and distributed rations, acting as the first bureaucracies. Clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped impressions, the first cuneiform, recorded these transactions. The earliest examples, dating to about 3200 BCE, speak not of kings or battles, but of barley, sheep, and beer. Writing was born from the need to remember numbers. Uruk grew vast, perhaps the largest city the world had yet seen, its population reaching tens of thousands. Canals laced the plain, markets crowded with potters, weavers, and metalworkers. The ziggurat of the goddess Inanna, its terraces faced with gleaming white plaster, stood above it all like a mountain made by human will. In its shadow, stories were told of a shepherd king named Gilgamesh, who sought the secret of immortality. In those tales, we hear the first recognizable echo of literature. Myth turned into memory. To the west, along the Nile, the scattered farming villages of Egypt were coalescing. By 3500 BCE, small kingdoms had formed along the river, each ruled from a fortified town. Hieroglyphic symbols appear on pottery and ivory tags. The Narmer palette, carved around 3100 BCE, records the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under a single ruler. In the centuries that followed, stone replaced mud brick. The first step, pyramids, rose at Saqqara, their courses of limestone catching the morning sun. The Egyptian state, organized, stable, and enduring, was the child of the same forces that had shaped the earliest farmers: water, flood, and faith. By now, the human story had entered the zone we call history. But vast regions still followed the older rhythm. In Europe's north, the builders of megalithic monuments raised standing stones in concentric rings. Earlier at Karnak in France, later at Stonehenge in Britain. Their exact purpose remains elusive. Calendars of the sun or ceremonial gathering places. Whatever their meaning, they required shared effort and a sense of belonging large enough to move stones that weighed more than an army of men. The same instinct stirred everywhere: to shape the land with intention, to leave a mark that might outlast its makers. The forgotten world of small fires and shifting camps had given way to permanent architecture, organized faith, and written record. Yet beneath the noise of growing cities, the older silence still lingered. The memory of glaciers, of migrations, of countless generations who had built the foundation for this first flowering of civilization. As the third millennium BCE unfolded, the land along the Nile glowed with the steady rhythm of sunrise and flood. Each year the river spilled over its banks, and when it withdrew, the earth was black and fragrant, soft beneath bare feet. Out of that fertile soil rose the first true kingdoms of Egypt. Generations of farmers had learned the Nile's moods. Now their descendants learned how to organize its gifts. Canals fanned outward like branches of a tree, feeding barley, flax, and emmer wheat. Surplus harvests fed administrators, scribes, and the artisans who began to carve the timeless face of their civilization in stone. The earliest dynasties, around 3100 BCE, united the Long Valley under a single crown. To travel from the delta marshes northward to the first cataract at Aswan was to pass 1,000 kilometers of ordered life. Villages, storehouses, temples, and the silhouettes of new monuments rising above the floodplain. Under the rule of kings such as Djoser, stone replaced mud brick. The architect Imhotep stacked limestone mastabas one atop another at Saqqara, creating the first pyramid, its steps reaching skyward in quiet geometry. Later rulers refined the idea until, on the Giza Plateau, perfect symmetry met the horizon. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, the largest single structure ever raised by human hands up to that time. The work was not the labor of slaves, as once imagined, but of thousands of skilled builders, quarrymen, and haulers organized in rotating crews. Their camps, excavated beside the pyramids, show bakeries, breweries, and physicians' tools. Even amid vast construction, the tone of life remained human. Bread baking in clay ovens, children playing near water jars, songs timed to the pull of ropes. The pyramids were less monuments of tyranny than expressions of shared faith. the idea that order on earth mirrored order in the heavens. While Egypt perfected the art of permanence, another civilization quietly flowered far to the east. In the wide alluvial plain of the Indus River, where the monsoon rains meet snowmelt from the Himalayas, cities of brick and symmetry appeared almost without prelude. By 2600 BCE, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro were already mature urban centers, their streets laid out on grids more precise than many that followed thousands of years later. Wells punctuated every courtyard. Drains ran beneath the streets, covered with fitted slabs. Public baths, granaries, and workshops spoke of a civic order both practical and humane. The people of the Indus left few obvious kings and no great tombs. Their script, cut into small seals of steatite and terracotta, remains undeciphered, yet its repeating patterns suggest commerce and standard weights. Warehouses stored barley and cotton cloth. Artisans shaped copper, bronze, and the first glass-like faience. Traders from the Indus carried goods by boat down the coast of Arabia to the cities of Sumer. In return, they brought silver, tin, and wool. Fragments of Indus seals have been found in the ruins of Ur. Mesopotamian records speak of a distant land called Meluha, rich in exotic woods and gems, almost certainly the Indus realm itself. At roughly the same time, along China's great rivers, another rhythm of civilization was taking shape. In the central plains near modern Zhengzhou, the Erlitou culture, often linked to the legendary Xia dynasty, cast ritual vessels of bronze around 1900 BCE. To the north, the Longshan peoples had already learned to fortify their towns with rammed earth walls and to polish black pottery to a mirror sheen. Across the eastern seaboard, jade carvers shaped green stone into ceremonial discs, objects of quiet beauty that still carried the perfection of patient hands. Bronze technology there evolved independently, giving rise to the grand cauldrons and bells that would later mark the Shang dynasty courts. Everywhere, the same impulse unfolded in different accents: to build, to measure, to understand the pattern of seasons. The spread of metallurgy linked regions once isolated. Tin from the mountains of Afghanistan or the hills of Anatolia found its way to workshops along the Tigris, to Nile foundries, to the workshops of the Aegean Islands. Traders and herders carried not only goods, but stories. Myths began to travel, flood tales, sky gods, the memory of a golden age lost to time. By 2000 BCE, the Bronze Age had become a web of connections stretching from the Atlantic coasts of Iberia to the rice fields of eastern China. In the Aegean, on the island of Crete, the Minoan civilization rose amid blue water and volcanic peaks. Palaces at Knossos, Paistos, and Malea grew around open courtyards where light fell in shafts between painted columns. Wall frescoes show dolphins, lilies, and women in flounced skirts dancing among musicians, a society that celebrated life as much as ritual. Their ships, long and narrow, stitched the Mediterranean together, bringing copper from Cyprus and fine pottery to Egypt and the Levant. Back in Mesopotamia, the great cities had seen empires rise and fall. The kings of Akkad, beginning with Sargon around 2330 BCE, forged the first political empire, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Tablets from his reign speak of standardized weights, postal routes, and daughters appointed as priestesses in distant temples. The cuneiform script, once a tool for accounting, had expanded to poetry, hymns, and law. The Code of Hammurabi, carved on black basalt about 1750 BCE, listed hundreds of judgments, some harsh, some protective of the weak. In its opening lines, the king declares that he acts to bring about the rule of righteousness, that the strong may not oppress the weak. Through that text, we can hear, for the first time, the voice of government as moral claim. The same centuries saw the steady deepening of Egyptian civilization into what historians call the Middle Kingdom. Pharaohs such as Senusret III extended canals through the Fayum Depression, turning desert into farmland. Sculptors carved portraits with eyes that looked inward, an art of realism and reflection. Beyond the frontiers, trade reached southward to Nubia for gold and ebony, and eastward across the Red Sea to the incense ports of Punt. For the people who lived along the Nile, the world had boundaries, but not isolation. Caravans and riverboats were constant threads tying them to distant lands. To the north in Anatolia, the Hittite kingdom was rising, its warriors wielding chariots rimmed with bronze and drawn by teams of horses bred on the steppe. In their archives, inscribed on clay, appear treaties written in 2 languages, the earliest examples of international diplomacy. The Hittites, like their Babylonian contemporaries, worshipped storm gods and sun deities, but their laws speak again of human measure, compensation instead of vengeance, negotiated peace instead of endless feud. Meanwhile, along the Indus, change was coming. Around 1900 BCE, the rivers shifted course, perhaps after earthquakes or prolonged drought. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro slowly emptied. New towns appeared to the east. People did not vanish. They adapted, moving toward the Ganges plain. The world's oldest urban experiment ended not with conquest, but with quiet dispersal, its memory preserved in soil and brick. To the west, in the Levant, coastal traders known as Canaanites and later Phoenicians began to master the art of navigation beyond sight of land. They charted the winds and currents of the eastern Mediterranean, carrying cedar, glass, and purple dye to Egypt and Mesopotamia. From their alphabet, simplified from earlier pictographs, the Greek and Latin scripts would one day descend. Each voyage, each ledger, was another thread in the net of shared human culture that now encircled the known world. Even in far-off Britain and Ireland, echoes of this age reached faintly across seas. Tin from Cornwall found its way into continental trade. Amber from the Baltic drifted south along river routes. By 2000 BCE, the great stones of Stonehenge stood aligned to the solstices, marking the year's longest and shortest days with unerring accuracy. It was a calendar of faith and farming alike, a testament that people everywhere had begun to measure time not only by survival, but by the heavens. The world at the dawn of the second millennium BCE was a mosaic of lights across continents, cities glowing beside rivers, caravans moving across deserts, sails swelling with the first reliable winds of long-distance trade. Yet beyond every settlement stretched the silence of forests, the dark of mountains, and the endless mystery of the sea. The forgotten world was fading, but it was not gone. Its habits, cooperation, curiosity, reverence for nature, remained the quiet foundation beneath all the stone and bronze. By the middle of the second millennium, BCE, the Bronze Age world was fully awake. Across 3 continents stretched a web of trade and diplomacy. Hittite chariots rumbling across the Anatolian plateau, Egyptian ships heavy with cedar and copper, Mycenaean sailors steering by the stars toward distant Cyprus and the Levant. The sound of bronze, hammer on anvil, rang from workshop to workshop, a metallic heartbeat of civilization. The ingredient that made it all possible was tin. Without it, copper was too soft. With it, bronze could hold an edge strong enough to cut wood, plow fields, or cleave armor. Yet tin was rare, scattered in far mountains, Cornwall, the Caucasus, Afghanistan. Merchants and caravans carried it over thousands of kilometers, passing through the hands of dozens of peoples. Every bar of metal that reached a foundry in Thebes or Ugarit was proof of cooperation between strangers. Along the Nile, Egypt entered the age historians call the New Kingdom, beginning around 1550 BCE. The pharaohs of this era ruled not just a river, but an empire stretching into Syria and Nubia. Temples bloomed along the riverbanks, Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel, each built to honor the gods and to remind the living of order's endurance. Hieroglyphs on polished walls record expeditions to Punt for incense and gold, and the names of kings who ruled for lifetimes, measured by the stars. The Queen Hatshepsut sent fleets down the Red Sea. The warrior Thutmose III marched through Canaan, leaving stele in every conquered city. Yet beneath the royal inscriptions, ordinary life continued as always. Farmers tending dikes, potters firing vessels, scribes sharpening reed pens. To the northeast, the cities of Canaan and Syria became crossroads of this busy world. Ugarit, on the coast of modern Syria, flourished as a port of traders and diplomats. There, cuneiform tablets written in 4 languages have been found in a single library: Akkadian for international letters, Hittite, and Hurrian for neighbors, and a new local alphabet of just 30 symbols, the direct ancestor of the scripts that would shape the modern world. On one tablet, a scribe recorded a shipment of copper ingots shaped like ox hides, each marked with the seal of its origin on Cyprus. Others record poetry and prayer, hymns to Baal, laments for lost crops, the voices of people who lived by the tide. Across the Aegean, the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece reached their height. Fortresses crowned rocky hills, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, linked by roads paved in fitted stone. Within their megaron halls, kings feasted from gold and silver cups, their exploits recorded on linear bead tablets listing grain, oil, and chariot wheels. The sea connected them to Egypt and the Levant. Amber from the Baltic and tin from Britain have been found in their graves. Their craftsmen, in turn, exported fine pottery and weapons to every shore of the Mediterranean. To the east, the Hittites balanced between friend and rival. Their capital, Hattusa, rose behind 6 kilometers of walls pierced by lion-headed gates. In archives there, scribes cataloged everything from treaties with Egypt to lists of horses and barley. One clay tablet bears the text of a peace treaty between the pharaoh Rameses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III, concluded after the Great Battle of Kadesh around 1275 BCE. Its words are formal but human, both sides swearing before their gods to maintain friendship for eternity. It is the world's earliest surviving peace agreement. Beyond the well-mapped centers, other cultures thrived in relative quiet. Along the Tigris, the Assyrians were growing into a disciplined, literate state. On the Iranian plateau, the Elamites traded and fought with their Mesopotamian neighbors. In the valleys of the Indus and Ganges, successor cultures such as late Harappan and painted gray ware, peoples carried forward the memory of urban life. In China, the Shang dynasty, flourishing by 1600 BCE, built walled cities along the Yellow River, and cast massive ritual bronzes inscribed with early Chinese characters. Oracle bones, turtle shells, and ox scapulae record questions to ancestors about harvests, hunts, and wars. Through those cracks and soot marks, the first sentences of Chinese history appear. The web of exchange extended even into Africa, beyond Egypt. In the lands south of the First Cataract, Nubian chiefs built tumulus graves and traded gold, ivory, and leopard skins northward. Across the Red Sea, the incense kingdoms of what is now Yemen grew rich, supplying the temples of the Mediterranean with frankincense and myrrh. Caravans threaded the Arabian deserts, leaving cairns and graffiti still visible in the rock. For the first time, one could imagine a journey from the Atlantic to the Indus without ever leaving the reach of human settlement. Yet every system carries the seeds of its own fragility. The same networks that spread wealth also spread crisis. Droughts in one land meant famine in another, dependent on its grain. Wars interrupted trade routes for metals. Migrations pressed against the edges of empires. Around 1200 BCE, a series of shocks rippled through the entire eastern Mediterranean. Archaeologists find burned cities from Greece to Syria. Mycenae, Ugarit, Hattusa, all fell within a few decades. Egyptian records speak of invasions by mysterious seaborne peoples, those who came from the north. Earthquakes, climate change, and social unrest all played their part. But to the people who lived it, it must have felt like the end of the world. In the chaos, writing faltered. Linear B disappeared from Greece. Cuneiform faded from Ugarit. Palaces were abandoned, their archives left to crumble. For several centuries, silence spread, where scribes had once kept precise accounts. Populations shrank, trade collapsed, and iron, newly mastered but crude, replaced bronze as the practical metal of everyday life. Yet even in collapse, continuity survived. In small villages, farmers kept planting, potters kept firing clay, and priests kept lighting fires to unseen gods. From those quiet survivors, the next ages would rise. When the dust settled, new peoples stepped onto the stage. The Phoenicians rebuilding along the Levantine coast. The Israelites shaping a faith centered on a single invisible deity. The Greeks rediscovering writing in alphabetic form centuries later. Out of the ruins of the Bronze Age came the roots of the classical world. The forgotten world before history had not truly vanished. It had transformed. The ingenuity that once tamed rivers now forged empires. The stories told beside fires became the myths of Homer and Hesiod. Beneath every later city, beneath the scripts and laws and monuments, still lay the same impulse born in the Ice Age: to remember, to explain, to build something that might outlast the night. As the first millennium BCE approached, the map of civilization had been redrawn. Egypt endured along its river. Assyria and Babylon reclaimed Mesopotamia. Small kingdoms rose along the Levant, and across the sea, the seeds of Greece and Italy were taking root. The experiment begun by farmers 10,000 years earlier had spread across the known world. Humanity had stepped firmly into history. The Bronze Age had ended in fire. Cities that had glowed beside the sea now lay silent, their stones darkened by smoke. Yet the people who survived those centuries of collapse did not vanish. They rebuilt slowly from the ashes. When they returned to the fields, they carried with them a new metal, iron, harder, more abundant, and born in smaller, humbler furnaces. Around 1100 BCE, the first iron blades glinted in the morning light, of Anatolia and the Levant. Bronze had needed tin from far-off mountains, but iron could be smelted almost anywhere. Villages that had once depended on long-distance trade could now arm and equip themselves. Tools grew stronger, plowshares bit deeper, and the rhythm of rural life quickened again. Humanity had entered the Iron Age, an age of renewal and expansion that would redraw the map of the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, the Assyrian kings rose from regional lords to empire builders. From their capitals at Ashur, Nimrud, and later Nineveh, they commanded armies of chariots and infantry armed with iron swords and spearheads. Reliefs carved on palace walls show rows of soldiers crossing rivers on inflated skins, battering the gates of walled cities, bringing tribute from distant lands. Their power rested not only on warfare, but on administration. Roads, relay posts, and written records that tracked every shipment of grain and copper. For the first time since the fall of Uruk, the cities of Mesopotamia spoke again with one voice. An empire of scribes and soldiers bound by cuneiform tablets and royal decrees. To the south, Babylon revived under the Chaldean dynasty, 1,000 years after Hammurabi. By 600 BCE, under Nebuchadnezzar II, its walls and temples gleamed again in the desert sun. The blue-glazed Ishtar Gate, its surface alive with lions and dragons, opened onto processional streets lined with palms. In the same years, the Hanging Gardens, whether myth or fact, became a symbol of human persistence. Greenery raised from arid ground by engineering and imagination. Across the narrow land bridge of the Levant, small kingdoms and city-states found room between empires. The Phoenicians of Tyre and Sidon built fast ships and slender letters, an alphabet of just 22 signs that merchants could learn easily. Sailors carried it across the Mediterranean. Within centuries, Greeks adapted it to their own speech. And the alphabetic principle, the idea that each sign represents a sound, would spread to most of the world's languages. The merchants who painted symbols on amphorae never guessed they were shaping the written future. Westward, on the islands and peninsulas of the Aegean, memory was returning. For nearly 400 years after the fall of Mycenae, Greece had been a land of farmers and small chiefs. But by 800 BCE, villages were gathering into polis, city-states, and new epics were being sung. The poems attributed to Homer, shaped by generations of bards, preserved echoes of the Bronze Age, the walls of Troy, the wanderings of Odysseus, the wrath of Achilles. When those verses were written down in the new Greek alphabet, they bridged the gap between myth and history. In their lines, listeners heard both nostalgia for the heroic past and recognition of their own reborn world. In the fertile plains of the Nile, Egypt endured. The new kingdom's grandeur had faded, but the temples still stood. Libyan dynasties, Nubian kings, and finally Persians would rule the valley. Yet the rhythm of flood and harvest, of prayer and procession, remained unchanged. Scribes continued to copy sacred texts on papyrus. The sound of reed pens scratching in the sunlit courtyards of Thebes was a music as old as the pyramids themselves. Meanwhile, to the east, a new empire was gathering. The Persians, once subjects of the Medes, united under Cyrus the Great in the mid-6th century BCE. His armies, disciplined and pragmatic, swept across Western Asia, capturing Babylon in 539 BCE without destroying it. Cyrus proclaimed tolerance for its gods and peoples, a vision of empire not built solely on conquest, but on respect. The Achaemenid realm that followed, stretched from the Indus to the Aegean, stitched together by the royal road. A highway of stone and packed earth along which couriers could carry messages hundreds of kilometers in a few days. At each station, fresh horses waited, and the empire breathed through them like a single living organism. Beyond the Zagros Mountains, on the Iranian plateau, other tribes watched the rise in power of Persia. To the northwest lay the early kingdoms of Urartu and Phrygia, rich in iron and timber. To the east, the highlands of Bactria and Sogdia, crossroads between Mesopotamia and India. Along those passes, caravans carried spices, textiles, and ideas. The ancient world was becoming connected in ways unseen since the height of the Bronze Age. But this time the links were stronger, sustained by empires able to patrol and maintain them. Farther east again, in the plains of northern India, a new phase of civilization was unfolding. After the decline of the Indus cities, centuries of rural life had passed quietly. Now, around 600 BCE, kingdoms known as Mahajanapadas filled the Ganges Valley. Iron tools cleared forests and opened vast tracts to rice cultivation. Towns such as Rajagriha and Vaisali bustled with merchants and monks. Out of this ferment came two spiritual revolutions: Buddhism, founded by Siddhartha Gautama, and Jainism, taught by Mahavira. Both questioned the cycle of violence and desire that seemed to rule human affairs, offering instead paths of compassion and self-knowledge. Their quiet voices, carried by wandering teachers, would echo across Asia for millennia. Across the mountains of the Hindu Kush, other travelers moved west. Horsemen from the steppes traded wool and metal. Caravans followed the dry routes that would later become the Silk Road. At the same moment, in China's Yellow River Basin, the Zhou dynasty was refining the art of governance. Its philosophers sought order not in divine kingship, but in moral principle. The teacher Confucius, born around 551 BCE, spoke of harmony between ruler and subject, parent and child, friend and friend, a social balance mirroring the order of heaven. Others, like Laozi, turned inward, teaching that the natural way, the Tao, was found in stillness rather than command. In the calm simplicity of their thought lay the seeds of a philosophical tradition that would shape East Asia long after the Zhou faded. Back in the Mediterranean, another current of reflection was beginning. The Greek thinkers of Ionia, Thales, Anaximander, Heraclitus, looked at the world and asked not which god caused the rain, but what substance underlay all things. From those questions grew natural philosophy, the ancestor of science. By 500 BCE, the city of Athens had become a meeting place of merchants, poets, and soldiers, a microcosm of the new, restless age. Its citizens began to debate the nature of justice and government itself, planting the roots of democracy amid the olive groves of Attica. At the same time, on the Italian peninsula, the Etruscans and the emerging city of Rome were learning from Greek and Phoenician traders. Bronze mirrors and imported pottery filled their tombs. Letters adapted from Greek became the Latin alphabet. In a few centuries, Rome would grow from a cluster of huts beside the Tiber into an empire, carrying the legacies of Greece, Egypt, and Mesopotamia far beyond their original horizons. By 500 BCE, the ancient world was alive with connection. From the British Isles to the Pacific, people smelted iron, minted coins, built roads, and wrote their histories. But beneath every innovation lay the quiet persistence of what had come before, the skill of shaping stone, the rhythm of seasons learned by Neolithic farmers, the instinct to mark meaning in clay or pigment. The forgotten world still breathed through these new civilizations, unseen but constant, like the pulse of the earth beneath pavement and palace alike. By the middle of the first millennium BCE, iron had spread to nearly every corner of the known world. The metal was humble in appearance, but it had equalized humanity. Farmers could now fashion their own tools. Soldiers no longer depended on the bronze hoards of palaces. Out of this new balance rose republics and empires, each borrowing from the same ancient foundation, yet giving it a new voice. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the Persian Empire stood as the largest political experiment humanity had yet attempted. Under Darius I, the Achaemenid administration mapped the world it ruled, measuring roads, counting tributaries, engraving decrees in 3 languages. Couriers galloped along the royal road from Sardis to Susa in little more than a week, their passage watched from stone relay posts. At Persepolis, terraces of polished stone carried palaces filled with reliefs showing delegates from every province. Greeks, Egyptians, Medes, Indians, all bringing gifts to the king. The sculptures seem almost timeless, faces calm, hands extended in offering, proof that the empire's strength lay not just in armies, but in its vision of order. To the west, a small city on the Aegean was beginning to test an idea far older than kingship, the rule of the citizen. In the 5th century BCE, Athens built its democracy, imperfect and fragile, but revolutionary. Its stoa-lined squares filled with voices. Its theaters echoed with the tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles. Its schools trained minds to question rather than to obey. The philosopher Socrates walked the streets, asking what it meant to live well. Plato and Aristotle turned those questions into systems of reason that would guide Western thought for 2,000 years. Around them, artisans raised the Parthenon on the Acropolis, its marble columns cut with a precision that still seems effortless in moonlight. Beneath its perfection was the same instinct that had shaped the circles of Göbekli Tepe, to find harmony between stone, proportion, and the unseen. Athens was not alone. Across the sea, Carthage, founded by Phoenician settlers, commanded the western Mediterranean with fleets of sleek ships. To the north, the Etruscans refined engineering and writing, teaching both to the young city of Rome. In the lands beyond the Aegean, Macedon gathered strength under Philip II and his son Alexander, who would one day carry Greek speech and art across Asia. When Alexander's armies crossed into Persia in 334 BCE, they were not merely conquering, they were connecting. From Greece to India stretched a corridor of cities. Alexandria in Egypt, Iconium in Bactria, where Greek theaters stood beside Persian gardens, and merchants spoke in many tongues. The blending of cultures that followed would become the Hellenistic world, a vast conversation between East and West. Meanwhile, in India, the Mauryan Empire rose under Chandragupta around 320 BCE. His grandson Ashoka, after wars of expansion, turned to peace and morality. Stone pillars inscribed with his edicts still stand from Afghanistan to the Bay of Bengal, their rounded tops shaped like lotus buds, their messages carved in Prakrit and Greek alike. "All men are my children," one reads. Through Ashoka's patronage, Buddhism traveled north along trade routes, carried by monks to Central Asia and China. The same trails that once moved tin and lapis now carried scriptures and ideas. In China, The warring states had finally ended in unity. The Qin dynasty, under Shi Huangdi, drew the first continuous wall across the northern frontier and standardized weights, coinage, and writing. After its brief, intense rule came the long peace of the Han. Their chroniclers compiled the earliest complete histories. Their engineers opened roads and canals. Their emissaries reached the oases of the Tarim Basin, meeting traders from the west. Silk, spices, and stories began to flow between worlds that had never met before. The threads of prehistory, movement, exchange, adaptation, were weaving themselves again, now on a continental scale. To the west, Rome was expanding from republic to empire. By the 1st century BCE, it ruled the Mediterranean, binding its provinces with stone roads and aqueducts. In its legions marched farmers turned soldiers, carrying the same iron that had freed their ancestors from dependence on bronze. Rome's engineers built arches and domes that still endure. Its lawmakers wrote statutes that still whisper in modern codes. Yet even in Rome's grandeur, echoes of the deep past lingered. Household hearths, where families offered grain to ancestors. Festivals timed to solstices older than the city itself. Across the oceans unseen by these empires, other civilizations thrived. In Mesoamerica, the Olmec carved colossal heads from basalt around 900 BCE and raised ceremonial centers aligned with the stars. In the Andes, the Chavin culture built temples at high altitude where conch trumpets sounded through stone corridors. In sub-Saharan Africa, ironworking appeared at Nok in modern Nigeria by 500 BCE, independent of Mediterranean influence. Everywhere the same pattern repeated: mastery of metal, organized belief, and art that sought permanence. By the beginning of the first millennium CE, the world's great civilizations had taken recognizable form. Han China, Imperial Rome, the Parthian and Kushan realms linking them, and countless kingdoms between. Each believed itself new, yet each rested on layers reaching back through millennia. The farmers of Jericho, the sculptors of Çatalhöyük, the painters of Chauvet. The forgotten world before history had become the soil from which history itself grew. If we could stand above the earth then, the planet would glitter at night in small clusters of light. Oil lamps in Roman villas, hearths in Chinese towns, torches flickering in Indian monasteries. Between those points stretched darkness and silence, but the darkness was alive, with travelers on foot, caravans under starlight, sailors steering by constellations first named in prehistoric skies. The same constellations watched over them that had watched over the mammoth hunters of Ice Age Europe. The human journey had come full circle, still guided by fire and memory, still looking upward for meaning. As the centuries turned, empires rose and fell in rhythms that felt newly grand, yet deeply familiar. Rome reached its height, then began to contract. Han China prospered, then divided. The pattern was the same one written long ago in the cycles of flood and drought, of birth and decay that had shaped the first fields of barley. Humanity had learned to build with stone and reason with words, but the pulse of change beneath it all was ancient. Merchants crossed the continents along the Silk Road, their caravans shimmering in heat haze and dust. From Antioch to Chang'an, they carried silk, glass, spices, and beliefs. Buddhism moved eastward with them. Ideas of geometry and medicine traveled west. At every desert well and mountain pass, languages mingled. The map of the world was no longer a patchwork of isolated valleys, but a single, breathing network of peoples. In that weaving of trade and curiosity, the deepest inheritance of prehistory, connection, found its fullest form. And yet, beneath the progress, the quiet world persisted. Farmers still watched the moon to time their planting. Shepherds still read the weather in the wind. Children traced patterns in dust, as their ancestors once had on cave walls. The skills of shaping and storytelling that had begun in stone shelters now filled libraries and temples. But the human need behind them had never changed: to remember, to explain, to belong. When night fell on any of those ancient cities, Rome's tiled roofs, Pataliputra's wooden halls, the walled towns of Han China, the streets emptied into the same darkness that had surrounded the camps of the Paleolithic. Torches guttered, hearths glowed low, and somewhere a voice recited a story to make sense of the day. The words might name gods, heroes, or ancestors, but their purpose was the same one it had always been: to hold back silence with meaning. If we look backward from our own age, the line of history seems to lengthen without end, but in truth, it is narrow. Written memory reaches only a few thousand years. Beneath it lie hundreds of millennia of unwritten life, whole epochs of experiment and endurance that shaped what it means to be human. Every tool we lift, every wall we build, carries the echo of those first stones struck together for fire. The forgotten world before history is not lost. It lies under our cities and within us, in the curve of a hand that still fits a handle, in the instinct to gather, to teach, to hope. The bones of ancient animals sleep beneath highways. The paths of vanished rivers still feed our soil. When archaeologists brush dust from a potsherd or trace a petroglyph with light, they are not only uncovering the past, they are touching the continuity of being. And so the story ends where it began, with the Earth itself. The same planet that carried the hunters through ice and forest carries us through our own uncertain seasons. The stars overhead have not changed. Only our understanding of them has grown. Long before history, humanity looked up and wondered. We still do. Let the mind drift there now, to the slow dawn over the first fields, to the hush of caves painted in ochre and shadow, to the patient rhythm of waves against forgotten shores. The noise of centuries fades. The pulse that remains is steady, ancient, and kind. It is the sound of continuity, the quiet heartbeat of the world before history, still echoing in every one of us.